It's my distinct pleasure now to introduce the Deputy Finance Minister, the Honourable Ashor Sarupen, to talk to us, and critical that building global mobility resilience, building those skills and the free flow of individuals across economies is only going to have a beneficial effect as far as the growth of South Africa is concerned. And we do know that that is a huge problem as far as this country is concerned. So, Deputy Minister, a very warm welcome to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jeremy. Thanks for the warm welcome. I will start by introducing myself. If you'll give me a moment, I am a digital person, so my notes are always on my phone. And I don't like using iPads because they duplicate what the iPhone does. So it's all one and the same. So let me start by giving you some background about myself. I studied at WITS, as I saw it says on the program, my sort of academic background. Started university a year early, so I was 17, and found myself tripped into politics quite by accident at WITS at an interesting time. We didn't realize how good we had it, but we also forget about some of the very bad things during that time, including things like AIDS denialism and so on. That was policy of the state. And that got me interested in politics while I was a science student. So, of course, I believe in evidence and evidence-based decision-making. And I got involved in politics because the loudest voice at that time against the AIDS denialism and making sure we made sure we had provision of antiretrovirals in this country was the Democratic Alliance. So that was a bit of how I got into politics. There's a longer story there that is best discussed over a drink, but I tripped myself into the DA, got involved as a student, and was there for many years. I was quite lucky that when I completed my degree, the Democratic Alliance hired me as a researcher and an analyst in the Gauteng legislature for its caucus, where I found myself doing lots of budgetary analysis and so on. I was then elected to the Ekurhuleni City Council, where I'm from, as a DA councillor, where I was appointed the Chief Whip in 2011. I was 21 years old, which is probably not the right age to be the Chief Whip of a 67-member caucus, but regardless, these things do happen, for better or worse. And so that was that, and spent 3 years in the City Council as a Chief Whip and also on the Public Accounts and other finance-orientated committees, getting to grips with things like the Municipal Finance Management Act. And again, at the time, the warning lights were on, but we didn't realize how good we had it compared to the state of municipalities right now. In 2013, I was asked to head up the DA's campaign for the Gauteng province. That was still our best ever election result in the province, so I always tip my hat to myself for that. And I was elected to the Gauteng legislature in 2014. I was promptly appointed as the DA spokesperson on finance. I also was on the education committees and one or two other things. In that time, I realized that a BSc is not enough to get to grips with the complexity of managing things and understanding complex systems and processes. So I did the unwise thing of enrolling in a WITS MBA, which costs a fortune, so I'd advise against paying for your own MBA. It's very expensive. And completed my MBA there. In 2019, I was elected to Parliament. We again appointed appropriations and finance committees in Parliament, and then also decided I was woefully underqualified for Parliament, so I enrolled at Gibbs in a Masters in Corporate Strategy, decided I was still too underqualified for what I was doing, and completed a Masters in International Business. And then, of course, I was the party's deputy campaign manager for election 2021 and 2024. I became the campaign manager as the party's campaign manager got ill in 2024. And as a consequence, of course, we had the government of national unity. And then I got the call up in July, early July, sort of just before the president made the announcement, saying, well, we've looked through everyone's CVs in the party, and we think you might be best qualified to be the deputy finance minister. At which point I sort of said, well, I suppose if I have to, there's nobody else. And so I was appointed, and so bounced into the office on the 3rd of July in the National Treasury, where it's been a very interesting year and a bit, a year and a month now, give or take, that I have been in this particular role. It has been no divorces, thankfully. Let me start there. but also no marriages as a consequence. But it's been a very, very interesting period of time in this first year of government. And I'll be the first to say that the pace of reform is not quick enough. And the kind of things that need to be done aren't happening quick enough. But at the same time, when I speak to, despite my own impatience, it might be the exuberance of youth, when I speak to my colleagues at the IMF and World Bank, for example, in energy reform, they always point out to me that in the 1980s and early 90s, the Latin Americans and Europeans went through the same thing. And South Africa has had the fastest tearing up of regulation in that sector that they have seen, particularly in energy. The follow-through is where a lot of work needs to be done. So I think the previous speaker I heard make the point that in South Africa we write great laws and then never see them through. Well, one of those is the Electricity Regulation Act. But I think when I look more broadly at the reform program, before I get into global mobility, and what's going on in South Africa that makes us attractive and will continue to make us more attractive as these reforms begin to come on stream, is the fact that while we are late to the party in structural reform, particularly network industries, the fact that we have now a stable and reliable regulatory framework means that the future is bright. So what do we need to do to make South Africa attractive and an investable destination? And the first single critical, most important thing that we can do is sort out electricity. Before we speak about some of the other binding constraints around ownership, around BE and so on, we can scrap all of those things, but nobody's going to invest in South Africa if we can't provide two things: stability of energy supply, and the second thing that we don't speak about is stability of pricing. So on stability of supply, the Electricity Regulation Act envisages that we move to a competitive market. And this competitive market is one in which you have multiple generating companies, not a monopoly in the form of Eskom, that will provide generating capacity for the country. You will have regional distributors and municipalities reticulating electricity to your homes and businesses. At the center, you'll have transmission. And this competitive market will work where big customers, industrial parks, municipalities, and distributors will go to transmission and say, we need long-term supply for 3, 4, 5, or 10 years. And the multiple generating firms will bid. Now, if you think about the kind of investment that'll bring into South Africa, it will be massive with a competitive market. And so that is one of the bright spots that I think is going to be quite positive for the future of investment in South Africa, and very likely will bring in, I suspect, a lot of external technical expertise in energy and energy finance and so on as we move towards that model. What is holding it up is the fact that we need to build 14,000 kilometers of transmission infrastructure. We generate a surplus of renewable energy right now in the Cape that we can't transmit to the rest of the country because our transmission infrastructure is designed to pull energy from the coal-fired plants in the north of the country down to the south and not the other way around. But that's the first bit of reforms, and certainly I think every bit of public pressure helps in seeing those through, because that is going to be one of the game changers. And that gets to stability of price. And on stability of pricing, currently we are in a situation where Eskom passes its inefficiency, as do our municipalities, onto the consumer. And so in the real economy since 2009, electricity prices have gone up over 200%, whereas consumer prices have gone up just over 100%. So a core driver of inflation is electricity pricing. And as a consequence, business decisions are now whether you pay your electricity bill, of course load shedding proof yourself, but firms have had to do that, or hire new staff, or decide if you're going to invest in expansion. Those are the trade-offs that the current system and market structure forces businesses to make. And you can imagine what a big deterrent on investment, and as consequently global mobility, is on what a deterrent this is on those two things. And so getting that right at the core has all sorts of positive spin-offs for the country, and what it would enable is a massive amount of direct foreign investment into energy and consequently a more competitive market in the long run. Now, what is the other big break that deters foreign investment, and consequently lots and lots of migration into South Africa as well, is the other one of our big network industries, and that is Transnet. And I see some smiles around the room and glints in people's eyes. The reality is that no other country in the world has a single vertically and horizontally integrated transport owner, employer, regulator, and operator. Nothing else like Transnet exists in the world because it creates a single point of economic failure. Of course, Transnet was one of the many victims of state capture, and all of the criminal networks have enmeshed itself into Transnet. But Transnet itself is so tightly vertically and horizontally integrated, it doesn't quite understand its own business and therefore what it spends its money on internally and its various units. So money comes in, money goes out, and of course, with very strong labor unions, nothing wrong with labor unions, of course, but we pay train drivers in South Africa for Transnet R1 million a year. So I often say to the Minister of Transport, if the GNU were to end, I'm available to work as a train driver. It's a good alternative career. But these are the consequences of some very bad decisions. And so what we need to do to make our economy competitive, attractive, get investment, and get skills into the country is to dismantle this monopoly. And you would have seen around the budget fight, one of the things that people weren't paying attention to was the back and forth around network industry reform. Because what was absolutely critical in that is the future of logistics in South Africa. It was quite interesting that CEOs of automotive firms in South Africa have said to me in multiple meetings I've had that they are taken aback that in South Africa it is cheaper to truck vehicles from Roslyn in Pretoria, where a lot of manufacturing happens, to Durban than to use Transnet's freight rail lines. It is cheaper to truck fuel around South Africa than it is to use Transnet's pipelines. Because again, monopolies pass their inefficiencies and corruption and market structure onto the consumer. And that has negative impacts on the economy. Our ports, as we all know, are some of the worst performing in the world. Cape Town is the worst performing small port in the world. Durban is near the bottom as a large port, and I think the medium-sized ports in Gqeberha also is ranked near the bottom of the world, in the bottom 5. And so port inefficiency and delays makes it impossible for us to move goods in and out of the country easily. And it is really becoming a break in business. By one study I've seen, the ports are costing the economy 357 billion rand a year. That's 5% of GDP, give or take. And that is a very, very serious break on growth. So in summary, in South Africa, what deters growth, investment, employment, and skills? It is, before we get to even the higher order policy things, it is the fact that we don't have reliable energy, and when we do, it's too expensive. So we can't move goods and services in and around the country cheaply or easily, and we cannot move goods and services in and out of the country cheaply and easily. And you can imagine just reforming those things can unlock massive amounts of growth. JP Landman, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with, he's a very, very capable economist, one of South Africa's best, says that if we see through the electricity reforms alone, it would add a full 1% to GDP growth annually. If we see through the reforms at Transnet and concession out the ports to people who are good at running ports and concession out the freight rail lines, people are good at running freight rail lines, these firms exist. There's lots of global and even regional and local expertise. We could then add another full 1%. So that we could go from this low growth trap of 0.7 and 0.6% that we've had over the last 2 years to 2.6 and 2.7. And suddenly South Africa becomes a lot more attractive to invest in and to live in. And so I think that if we can drive through this reform program, then we can find a lot more positivity about our country than we currently have. And this is on the table. And it's being executed transversely through a unit called Operation Vulindlela. And I strongly encourage anyone who is interested in these kinds of reforms in public forums and so on to invite one Mr. Rudy Dix, who is the head of the presidential, the project management unit in the presidency, to engage people who are interested about economic reform on these reforms, because these are the things that will get us to growth. And why is that growth conversation so important? Because the country will not be attractive if we continue to have declining GDP per capita. So population growth in South Africa is 1.6%. That has been around that since 2009. But in the same time, since 2009, GDP growth has averaged 1.194%, which means every year, on average, South Africans get poorer. And you see this in the substitution effect in the market and the choice of cars we purchase and so on. It is happening in real time in front of our eyes that our country, on average, is getting poorer because population growth outstrips GDP growth and has, on average, for the last 15 years. So we've got to get that growth number to be above the population growth number if we are going to get our country working and our economy moving. And that's why it's so critical. So just getting it to that 2.6 on base level reforms in our network industries would drive a lot of positivity about our country. Now, I wasn't here asked to speak only about structural reforms, of course. I was asked to speak about the type of relationships South Africa has with the world from a financial perspective and how we position ourselves. And I think it's important that we break down a few myths in order to address that question. I think the first is that there are many, many people driven by conspiracy theories, I see them on Twitter and so on, that somehow the world is out to get South Africa. It might be true for the Trump administration, I'm not sure. I haven't engaged with anyone from that administration. I don't know what their motives are. But truthfully, nobody is out to get South Africa. In fact, we have been quite lucky that because of our history and the global attention to our history, we've occupied a particularly special place in the world that has allowed us to get away with things that most countries don't get away with. So I think it's important when we unpack South Africa's financial relationship with the world and how we position ourselves, we must understand that is the first core fact. I think the second core fact to understand is that we are a small, middle-income, open economy, which makes us, in the global stage, policy takers, not policy makers. We were once upon a time the 25th largest economy, about 15 years ago. We're now sort of the 45th largest, which puts us way down. And if you go down to GDP per capita with purchasing power parity, we drop well down into the 80s and 90s. So truthfully, from a global perspective, and it pains me to say this as a patriotic South African politician, we're not particularly special or important in the global stage. And so nobody's going to rush to our defense. When I go to the BRICS meetings as the Deputy Finance Minister, we might as well be the apostrophe S. Because those economies dwarf ours, and they can take decisions, they can build buffers that we just don't have the capacity, the size, the growth rates, or the population numbers to do. And so in this environment where we are policy takers, not policy makers, we need to understand that we must position ourselves as an emerging market competing for investment. And that capital has anywhere in the world it can go. It can go to India, it can go to China. Even with slowing growth in China, they're still getting 4.9% GDP growth. It can go to Rwanda, it can go anywhere. So we are in a competition for global finance and global investment. And so the question is then, if we are in this competition, why do we make it so difficult for investment? Why do we have European Union-style legislation for an emerging market? And it's because South Africans love to regulate. And of course, every time something happens in South Africa, the first question is, what is the government doing about it? Not what can the markets do, how can we plug the gap? It is, what is the government doing about it? Which of course means that we create the feedback loop so governments to constantly respond. And what do governments do? The only thing they can do, we make laws, we regulate, and we set the police and the judiciary on you when you don't abide by those laws and you don't abide by that regulation, which creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of making things harder and harder and harder to do. So in this environment where we are now competing, and we are competing with every other emerging market, and because it has been 31 years since our wonderful liberation story, we're no longer that special, and nobody really cares anymore about your history. They want to know about your future. We have got to position ourselves far better on the global stage. That means that we've got to engage in genuine non-alignment on foreign policy. Genuine non-alignment. We can't pick sides. We can't pick and we can't tacitly pick sides either, that we have got to not look for enemies and not look for friends, just look for investments. And we have got to make sure that we create the kind of financial incentives and regulatory frameworks that maximize inward investment into our country. The truth is our domestic economy is characterized by weak domestic demand, low aggregate demand, and so the only way to raise that is to get direct foreign investment. And as the environment does become more competitive and as countries turn inwards, I think the previous speaker made the point about capital flows, particularly in countries like the United States, turning inwards as well. And of course, the new philosophy of trade, not aid as well, means that you can't rely on guaranteed capital flows to fund certain kinds of government programs as well. Means that this is changing. And there's something deeper within that relationship as well, and that is when we look at other countries that were able to prop up government budgets across the African continent, like the European Union, the United States change in policy also means that they are now shifting aid budgets towards propping up defense spending. And so less and less of that is flowing into Africa and particularly into South Africa. And so we've got to position ourselves a lot more cleverly, a lot more strategically, and we've got to figure out what the red carpet looks like for investment. And quite frankly, we don't have it right now. We are too trapped in policy frameworks that were created between 94 and 98 to resolve the problems of 94 and 98, and we need to resolve the problems of 2025. And every single policy that was written had a context and a history and a set of circumstances to it, but those sets of circumstances no longer exist. And that is why, again, I started with structural reform, because there's a lot more that we need to do for reform in tax law and in financial market regulation and in investment legislation and so on, to be able to position ourselves more strongly. And even where there is what I call cheap money available in the global economy, we make it very difficult because of our own politics to take advantage of that money. So every time South Africa gets a World Bank loan, there is massive amounts of negative press and massive amounts of backlash for us using World Bank money. Now, let me say this. 90% of South Africa's government debt, the 7 trillion rand debt stock that we have, is rand denominated. 75% of that is sold to local financial firms, pension funds, insurers, and banks. So by being completely resistant to direct foreign investment and by being resistant to what is, I consider, very cheap money from global financial institutions, what we're doing is making the domestic economy even more uncompetitive. Because when a government borrows 400 billion rand a year, most of which we take on the domestic capital markets, why on earth would any financial institutions want to take risks with small and medium businesses when they're guaranteed to get 11% returns by buying government bonds? We turn ourselves into a bond economy with this kind of rhetoric. And of course, government borrows on the bond market. Bond yields for 10-year bonds are around 11%. Sometimes it spikes up to 12%. World Bank bucket rates, you can get them as low as 3 or 4% interest. But we want to turn this down and go into a meltdown every time. So we position ourselves very badly when there is development finance available that would solve a lot of our critical problems. And we've got to let go of some of these 1960s ways of thinking and 1960s ways of doing things and understand that this has changed. We've also got to change the way we view some of these institutions and not get caught up in any kind of global geopolitical tension ourselves. The World Bank and the IMF are no longer the institutions of structural adjustment. They no longer come to your country and say, we will cut all of these programs. They will just come when you have a crisis and say, you must make revenue fit expenditure and here's a loan. That's basically their philosophy. Similarly, the New Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, and so on, are all good partners who likewise are not out to get us. And so we must take advantage of all of the multilateral institutions available to drive development in South Africa. The third point I was asked to speak about today is what are the things that I believe that will promote South Africa, and what do I want to achieve as the Deputy Minister? So I think this, apart from energy and ports and rail, the next biggest thing we need to solve is local government. And you might again ask, what has that got to do with global mobility? Well, look at the city that is now become a global city, the city of Cape Town. Even in a context of a stagnant GDP and a weak economy, Cape Town made itself a global city over the last 10 years. And that's because its municipal services function. Johannesburg used to be, not too long ago, it was for a period of time living up to its name, the world-class African city. And so the development in Sandton and Bryanston and elsewhere around here allowed us to live up to that particular reputation. The truth is that over the last couple of years in particular, it is in a state of serious decline. And I measure it by something very simple. When I am going around Johannesburg, there is a thick layer of dust, because when the roads are dug up and things aren't fixed, then of course the thick layer of dust covers everything. Whereas in the city of Cape Town, when I go around there, you don't have that thick layer of dust, because when they dig up the roads, they go and patch it up, which is those simple things. So what do I want to fix apart from energy and port and rail? The third thing is local government. Because if we don't get that right, South Africa is on the long road to ruin, and there's not much that you can do if you don't have water that is reticulated to your taps and clean. The energy, we can sort out energy and we can sort out the big picture, but if the municipality can't reticulate it to you and you have energy outages for 6 or 7 days in a row, becomes almost pointless, and you become an even weaker destination for investment and migration. Then similarly, sewage, refuse removal, roads and streetlights. I mean, these things aren't difficult. I was recently on a transit back from the Central African Republic via Kigali, and my flight, I missed my connection and I was trapped in Kigali for a night. And driving around, I counted more streetlights working in the small, bustling now town of Kigali than the city of Johannesburg, which pained me tremendously. So one of the projects that I'm leading at the National Treasury is something called Metro Trading Services Reform, because our cities need to become engines of growth. It is absolutely critical because it will change the way local government functions. And the first thing that we are doing is sorting out water, because of course water is essential for human life. And what we have started is a program with municipalities funded by the World Bank, those dreaded people, partially funded by the World Bank, in order to turn water departments into business units, ring fence the business unit for water, then make sure we understand cost of supply. What does it cost to purchase water from the bulk supplier, to reticulate it to your home, to fix the leaky pipes, to install telemetry on the reservoirs, and to make sure that the reservoirs function, and then to build future infrastructure as well. What does that all cost? And then, of course, make sure that we ring-fence the revenue. Now, that's a fancy term for saying that every month, every person in this room gets billed for water. The municipality takes the wonderful amount of money that you pay for water and spends it on whatever they want. It doesn't go back into water. It goes into political employees, it goes into beadworking projects, whatever you can imagine a municipality decides its priorities are. Which means that the infrastructure maintenance build future planning doesn't happen. And so when I look at a place like the city of Johannesburg, when I look at the analytics, there's something very interesting. Cost of employees has ballooned. Investment into infrastructure maintenance has declined massively over the last 10 years. That's a situation we have to turn around. So by ring fencing these water units, turning them into business units, and making sure that every cent that a citizen in a municipality, in a metro at least, pays for water, gets reinvested into water, will hopefully enable us to stabilize supply of water. Now, this does mean that a lot of political pet projects in municipalities will have to come to an end. There's been a lot of chatter about rates increases and lots of good discussions around value for money and so on, because obviously property rates are going to have to plug the gap when you start taking the revenue away from being used for everything and saying you will use it on your trading services. But this is absolutely critical to secure the future of our cities. And by securing the future of our cities, we can then secure the future of our country in a rapidly urbanizing environment. An interesting statistic for me always is that in 1994, 50% of South Africa's population lived in rural areas. In 2025, 70% of our population lives in 13 metros or major urban centers. But all of our structures and frameworks and so on are designed for a 94 environment where we redistribute massive amounts of money to rural areas with declining populations and a rapidly urbanizing environment. And so again, I go back to that point earlier, that we have frameworks that have not been changed when they were put into place from 94, and systems to solve 94's problems, not 2025's problems. But I do believe that metro trading services reform will produce results in the medium term. It's not sexy, it's not going to be a big announcement. It will take 3 to 4 years to complete, and then it'll take another 2 to 3 years for all the maintenance to be done. But in the long run, we stabilize water, then we stabilize energy, then we stabilize sewage and sanitation, then we stabilize refuse removal. And hopefully that will begin to deliver growth as well. So a lot of what I speak about is not exciting and global as much as the people want a treasury to be this exciting global financial place. It is about solving the core problems that will help us to become globally competitive again. I mean, there are all sorts of other things that I would like to achieve, but the truth is in government, I'm going to say this bluntly and honestly, you have a finite amount of time in office. You have 5 years if you're lucky. And so you've got to pick your priorities. And you've got to relentlessly pursue 3 or 4 priorities every single. You've got a finite amount of time with government officials, and government officials will only do what they're repetitively asked to do. So if you make everything a priority, nothing gets done. And that's the other challenge, why South Africa not globally competitive. Because we set everything as a priority, and we want to solve every problem. The truth is that every political administration and every politician you meet only has 8 hours of work a day. We're not superhuman beings. And we're working with government officials who also work 8 hours a day, provided we are in the office, making sure that they're at work, of course. And those are the constraints you're given. So if you set, and there is a lot of political, everybody wants their problem solved by government, but the truth is no politician can deliver that. So I know that everything I've said doesn't sound particularly exciting, but I'm convinced and persuaded, based on data and research, that by focusing on network industries and municipal reform and making that my overarching focus for the next couple of years, that we can resolve some of the bigger constraints in the country. Some of the other things that are put into place to help promote South Africa and that we want to achieve with the Treasury is peaking government's debt this year. That's the debt to GDP ratio. It's hit 77%. We always anticipated that we would be able to peak it this year, but it's got to be done. We cannot sustain this debt to GDP ratio as it stands. It crowds our capital, it raises the cost of capital, it makes us less investable as a financial market and as a destination, as an investment destination. So we must deal with that problem. And what is the strategy, you might ask? It's very easy to say, we'll peak it this year. The strategy is to return to what we know worked in the mid-2000s under Trevor Manuel, and that was to run a growing primary fiscal surplus. Now, what does that mean? It means that every year in tax revenue, we must spend less on non-interest expenditure than we are spending in providing public services and the government's general expenditure. So last year we ran our first primary surplus in a very long time. I think we came in at 0.4% of GDP. We're planning to come in at 0.8% this year, hopefully, and then grow every year well into the future for the next 15 years, and that will help lower government's debt and the debt burden on society, which hopefully will help alleviate some of the tax issues as well. And it's absolutely critical. So it does require a lot of fiscal discipline. And so you will often hear people say national treasury is heartless and national treasury is this and that. What we are doing is administering the medicine now because the patient needs it, because the patient is terminal. And it is very, very critical that we do that. So that is one of the other things that we need to achieve, is lowering government debt, and that has all sorts of long-term benefits for the economy and will help boost growth. But in this context, I've given you lots of doom and gloom. What makes South Africa a great partner for foreign businesses and foreign trade relationships? That was the fourth area of discussion that I was asked to touch on. And what makes South Africa a great investment environment for foreign business and foreign trade relationships, first and foremost, is the South African people. Firstly, we are an English-speaking country, which is the global language of business. We have better English skills, and I really wish we didn't have Telkom's monopoly in the early 2000s, because we could have become the call center capital of the world. Sadly, India beat us to that, but there is a lot of growth in that and sort of outsourced business processes and so on at the moment in South Africa. So the South African people, English-speaking, we're warm, we are generally good-natured, and over the last year, because I spent a lot of time in emerging markets, I've discovered something I didn't quite understand about South Africa. We're quite an orderly society. Apart from taxi drivers, there are rules on the roads. I mean, if any of you have ever been to India, my first trip to India, driving out of the airport, I thought I was going to die as the driver started veering across. I was recently in the Central African Republic, where in the capital where there are roads, there are no rules. Generally, there are no roads out there. So having been to and studied multiple emerging markets, we are an orderly society. And that is not something to be underestimated either. It does make us a good partner for foreign business and foreign trade relationships. And so that the general sense of South African people are there. Productivity, South Africa we could do better on worker productivity. And our labor regime does leave much to be desired by global standards, but as the automotive manufacturers say to me, on average, South African workers are no more or less productive than global norms, so we are okay, we could be more competitive there. But it is not an overarching deterrent. So again, the South African people is what makes us good for foreign businesses and foreign trade relationships. The second thing, and again, from my experience now studying a lot of emerging markets over the last year, well-developed capital markets. I've been up and down this continent over the last year into countries that have no functional capital markets, from which you cannot get money in the domestic economy to drive investment and to fund businesses, to fund growth, to get loans and so on. Those capital markets simply don't exist. Where they do exist, it's micro-lending by some do-gooders on the internet, which is very sweet, but is not good for a functional economy. So the fact that we have a big financial services sector is a massive asset. It creates, it's a massive stabilizing force for the economy and helps to contribute to macroeconomic stability, which is a third thing that we have that lots of countries don't have. And that is macroeconomic stability. I'm always entertained when people come and say to me, South Africa needs to do what Milei in Argentina did. Well, we did it in the 2000s, truthfully. His reforms are not in the macroeconomy. Argentina has the opposite problem to South Africa. They've got high levels of employment and low levels of macroeconomic stability. We have high levels of macroeconomic stability and low levels of employment, or lower levels of employment. And so what has he done? Well, simply he stopped borrowing money from the Reserve Bank and not paying it back, which is always a good thing. We don't borrow money from the Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank is not reserved for the government, thankfully, amongst other things. So obviously inflation targeting and those sort of things that we instituted in the 2000s are in place. So we have macroeconomic stability, which means that investors can trust that when you invest in South Africa, you won't have the massive erosion of your capital. And it's not to be underestimated or scoffed at. Macroeconomic stability is an absolutely critical stabilizing force for any country. So that is the third thing that we have going for us. That makes us a good partner for foreign business and foreign trade relationships. The fourth thing that we have going for us is that for this continent, we are still the most industrialized country with very few institutional voids. If you go to up and down any country across the continent, many emerging markets, there is no framework for how to do things. You are at the mercy of some government official who may or may not determine what the regulation is today and change it tomorrow. We don't have that here. We might have complicated regulation, but we've got stable regulation. And that is also something that makes us very, very attractive for foreign businesses and foreign trade relations, so that we don't have those kinds of institutional voids. And so those things together do make us a marketable and investable destination. Together with some of the reforms at Home Affairs, I think we are now able to bring in more skilled people. And those kinds of reforms are quite important because in the South African economy, we know from modeling, I go into theory again, as I heard the point, government officials love theory and not reality, but The modeling shows us that for every skilled person you bring into South Africa to fill a management or highly skilled vacancy in engineering or anywhere else, you create 7 unskilled jobs. And so the reforms at Home Affairs are also not to be underestimated. They're absolutely critical, and that makes us an increasingly important and increasingly attractive destination for foreign partners, foreign businesses, and foreign trade relationships as well, particularly in a context where we are seeing less global mobility and spurning of skilled individuals being mobile across the planet. And so those things, I think, make us a very, very capable economy to absorb lots of skilled migrants, to be able to grow this economy and create lots and lots of jobs for the many unskilled South Africans who need to find those jobs as well. So all in all, I think that if we can get some of the basics right, if we can let go of thinking from the 1960s and the early 1990s, and if we can try to solve the problems of 2025, the baseline is in place. We just need to take the necessary steps, pull the necessary levers, get the right kinds of public pressure into the system. And I take every opportunity I can with every audience I can to say that truthfully, politicians don't have a monopoly in wisdom. In fact, we have very little wisdom, as the last 10 years, 15 years have shown us. And so every piece of public participation that comes around, on the budget, on tax policy, and so on, we do get input from the South African Institute of Tax, but very little from ordinary citizens who are engaged and so on. Please use those platforms. When you see a piece of legislation and it's open for public comment, don't treat it as just a suggestion, I'll get to it. Use it. An engaged group of people who can offer solutions and put the right pressure into the political system is how we can pull the levers I've discussed this morning to get the country moving again. I've been speaking for 40 minutes straight, which is a record for me. I try to give shorter speeches. So with that, I'd say thank you very much, and thanks for your time.